September 7th, 1940. 20:45 hours. Liverpool Street, Underground Station, London. Margaret Collins descended the station stairs, carrying her 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and a canvas bag containing everything she thought they'd need for the night. Blankets, a thermos of tea, some bread, Elizabeth's favorite stuffed rabbit. Above ground, air raid sirens wailed their rising-falling warning. In the distance, the first bombs were already falling on East London docks, the explosions audible even through the station's concrete and tile. The platform was filling rapidly with people who'd made the same calculation Margaret had. Better to spend the night in the underground than risk staying in houses that might be destroyed by bombs they couldn't see or predict. Families were claiming spaces along the platform walls, spreading blankets on concrete, settling in for what would be the first of 57 consecutive nights of bombing that history would call the Blitz. Margaret found space near the tunnel entrance, where the curve of the wall provided slight shelter from the draft. She spread her blanket and sat with Elizabeth in her lap, the child already drowsy despite the noise and crowds. Around them, hundreds of other Londoners were doing the same, creating temporary homes in space designed for temporary transit, transforming railway platform into overnight refuge. The official position was that people shouldn't use the underground as air raid shelter. The government had designated purpose-built shelters and reinforced basements, had distributed Anderson shelters for back gardens, had prepared official facilities that were supposed to be adequate for civilian protection. But those facilities weren't adequate. Anderson shelters were uncomfortable and often flooded. Public shelters were overcrowded and poorly equipped, and basements offered minimal protection against direct hits. So Londoners had taken matters into their own hands. When stations tried to close at their usual times, crowds gathered outside, demanding entry. When authorities resisted, people broke through or simply refused to leave after arriving on trains. The government's prohibition became unenforceable through sheer weight of civilian determination. If official shelters were inadequate, people would create their own shelters in spaces that actually provided protection. The deep tube tunnels that offered safety even from direct hits on surface buildings. By late September, the government had abandoned its prohibition and begun organizing the inevitable. If Londoners were going to shelter in the underground, regardless of official policy, then authorities would regulate and improve conditions rather than fighting futile battle against civilian common sense. Margaret and the thousands around her that night represented victory of popular will over bureaucratic resistance, of practical necessity over official preference. The bombs continued falling through the night. The sound penetrated even to the platform, muffled thunder, rhythmic and unrelenting. Elizabeth slept fitfully, waking occasionally when particularly close explosions made the platform vibrate. Margaret dozed, sitting up, her back against the tile wall, keeping Elizabeth warm under the blanket. Around them, the platform filled with similar scenes, repeated hundreds of times, parents protecting children, families maintaining small islands of normalcy amid chaos, ordinary people enduring extraordinary circumstances through nothing more than stubborn determination to survive. The Blitz begins. Germany's strategic bombing campaign against London was designed to break civilian morale and force British government to negotiate peace through terror and destruction. The campaign began on September 7th, 1940, when approximately 300 German bombers attacked London's docks and East End in daylight raid that killed over 400 people and started hundreds of fires. That night, another wave of bombers struck, beginning pattern of day and night raids that would continue with brief interruptions through May 1941. The attacks were meant to be overwhelming, so destructive and so frightening that British civilians would demand their government surrender rather than endure continued bombing. The strategy was based on assumptions about civilian psychology that proved incorrect. German planners believed that urban populations would panic under sustained bombing, that casualties and destruction would create demand for peace at any price, that breaking civilian will would be easier than defeating British military forces. These assumptions reflected German experiences in Poland and Low Countries, where bombing had contributed to rapid military collapse, but they misunderstood fundamental differences between populations with recent memories of war and occupation versus British population that had been spared invasion for centuries. London's immediate response to bombing was neither panic nor collapse, but practical adaptation. After initial confusion, civilians developed survival routines, monitoring air raid warnings, moving to shelters when sirens sounded, resuming normal activities when all clear was given. The bombing was terrifying and deadly, but it was also endurable through organization and mutual support. Londoners learned what could be survived and what couldn't, developed instincts about where to shelter and when to run, created informal knowledge that helped navigate dangers that official guidance couldn't fully address. The casualty statistics were substantial, but not catastrophic. The Blitz would kill approximately 43,000 British civilians by May 1941, with over 130,000 tons of bombs dropped on British cities. London bore the heaviest burden, over 18,000 killed in the capital alone. These were real losses that devastated families and communities, but they were losses that the city could absorb while continuing to function, losses that hardened determination rather than breaking will. The unauthorized shelters. The government's initial resistance to using underground stations as air raid shelters reflected legitimate concerns about safety, sanitation, and maintaining transportation services. The tunnels weren't designed as shelter spaces. Ventilation was minimal, designed for brief occupancy by passengers rather than overnight habitation by thousands. Sanitation facilities were inadequate for crowds camping overnight. Medical facilities were non-existent. The risk of panic, if bombs damaged stations with people inside, was substantial. Hundreds or thousands might be trapped with no escape routes. Maintaining train services while people sheltered on platforms seemed impossibly complicated. These concerns were real but became irrelevant when Londoners simply refused to accept official alternatives. The first unauthorized sheltering began in early September, when people entering stations before closing time simply refused to leave, bedding down on platforms and stating they'd stay until morning, regardless of official policies. Station staff lacked authority to forcibly remove hundreds of determined civilians, and calling police to evict people seeking safety from bombs was politically untenable. The next stage was people buying cheap tickets and then refusing to board trains, remaining on platforms after stations should have closed. This violated regulations, but didn't involve trespass or breaking and entering. Authorities couldn't arrest people for not boarding trains they'd paid to access. The passive resistance was effective precisely because it was passive. Not violent confrontation, but simple refusal to comply with policies that people considered inadequate for their safety. By late September, the government capitalized to reality. Home Secretary Herbert Morrison announced that stations would be opened as official shelters, with government support for improving conditions and organizing occupation. The decision recognized that fighting civilian determination was futile, and that official organization could at least mitigate the problems that unauthorized sheltering created. The policy shift from prohibition to regulation transformed chaotic occupation into managed system that would eventually shelter nearly 200,000 Londoners nightly. The organization of underground life. Converting railway platforms into livable shelter spaces required improvising systems for managing crowds, maintaining sanitation, providing basic services, and preserving some semblance of order in unprecedented circumstances. The initial chaos was substantial. Platforms filled without organization, with people claiming space through first-come priority that created crowding and disputes. Sanitation was crisis. Station toilets couldn't handle crowds, and no alternative facilities existed. Ventilation was poor, creating air that was hot and stale and laden with human odors. Food and water weren't provided, forcing people to bring supplies or go without. Medical care was absent, beyond whatever first aid civilians could provide themselves. Local authorities and volunteer organizations gradually imposed order on chaos. The London County Council established official allocation systems for platform space, marked positions with white lines, limited how much space each person could claim. Portable toilets were installed in tunnels and on platforms, though never in adequate numbers for the crowds using them. Ventilation systems were improved where possible, though the fundamental limitation of inadequate air circulation remained problematic. Bunks were constructed in many stations, metal frames with canvas stretched between them, stacked 2 or 3 high, along platform walls. The bunks provided marginally more comfort than sleeping on concrete and allowed more efficient use of space, though they also created impression of permanence that concerned authorities who worried people would become too comfortable sheltering rather than seeking more permanent housing solutions. Canteens were established by volunteer organizations, typically church groups or women's organizations that mobilized to provide hot food and tea. The canteens operated on donations and volunteer labor, serving simple meals to people who'd been sheltering overnight. They became social centers where people gathered not just for food, but for community and conversation, for maintaining human connections that made sheltering bearable rather than merely endurable. Medical services were organized through volunteer efforts by doctors and nurses who staffed aid posts in larger stations. The services were basic, treating minor injuries, providing basic medicines, monitoring for diseases that crowded conditions might spread. Serious medical emergencies required transport to surface hospitals, a complicated process during raids when ambulances might be occupied with bomb casualties and streets might be blocked by damage. Libraries appeared in some stations, book collections donated or organized by local librarians, available for borrowing by shelterers. Entertainment was organized, ranging from informal sing-alongs to more structured concerts by professional musicians who volunteered to perform underground. These cultural activities served psychological purpose beyond mere entertainment, maintaining sense that life continued despite bombing, that civilization persisted even in uncomfortable circumstances. The daily rhythm. Life underground followed patterns that combined necessity with attempts to maintain normalcy despite extraordinary circumstances. People typically arrived in early evening before raids began, claiming their spaces and settling in for the night. Families established routines, spreading blankets, arranging possessions, preparing whatever food they'd brought. The routines provided psychological comfort through familiarity, creating sense of control in circumstances where actual control was limited. Meals were eaten from packed supplies or purchased from canteens. The food was basic but adequate. Sandwiches, soup, tea, whatever could be prepared simply or brought from home. Sharing was common, with families offering portions to neighbors or children receiving treats from adults who had none of their own. The sharing reinforced community bonds and ensured that everyone had at least minimal nutrition. Entertainment occupied evening hours. Children were read to or told stories. Adults conversed or listened to radios when available. Musicians performed. Community sing-alongs were common, with groups singing popular songs or hymns, creating sound that drowned out bombs and reinforced solidarity. The entertainment wasn't sophisticated, but it was effective at maintaining morale and providing distraction from circumstances that were uncomfortable and frightening. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by bomb concussions, by children crying, by the general noise and discomfort of hundreds of people sharing confined space. The concrete platforms were hard despite blankets. The air was stale and warm. The constant noise, snoring, coughing, conversations, distant explosions made true rest difficult. But exhaustion eventually produced sleep, and most people managed enough rest to function during daylight hours. Morning brought mass exodus as all-clear sirens signaled raid's end. Thousands of people gathered belongings and climbed stairs to surface, emerging into daylight to discover what damage night's bombing had produced. Some found their homes destroyed or damaged. Others found familiar streets altered by new craters or collapsed buildings. But most found their homes intact and proceeded to wash, dress properly, and head to work or school as if overnight sheltering was merely minor inconvenience rather than response to sustained attempt to kill them. The psychological burden. The sustained stress of bombing and crowded sheltering created psychological toll that statistics couldn't capture, but that affected everyone enduring it. Margaret Collins managed better than some. Elizabeth was young enough to adapt, accepting underground sheltering as normal once initial strangeness passed. Margaret's husband was serving with British Expeditionary Force. She'd had no word from him since Dunkirk evacuation and didn't know if he was alive, but that uncertainty predated the Blitz, and she'd learned to function despite it. Her job in munitions factory continued, providing income and purpose that helped maintain routine. She had friends among regular shelterers, women in similar circumstances who provided support and company. But the cumulative strain was real. The constant fear when sirens sounded, the disrupted sleep, the loss of privacy, the uncertainty about whether her home would survive each night's bombing. The worry about Elizabeth's development in circumstances that no child should experience. The general exhaustion of maintaining appearance of normalcy while living in fundamentally abnormal conditions. Margaret coped, but coping required constant effort that wore at psychological reserves in ways that gradually accumulated. Others struggled more visibly. Some people developed anxiety or depression that made functioning difficult. Others became irritable or withdrawn. Children showed stress through behavior changes, nightmares, clinging behavior, regression in development. The underground communities included people barely holding together psychologically, maintaining only through social support and stubborn determination to endure. The government provided minimal psychological support, no formal counseling services, no recognition that sustained bombing created mental health challenges requiring professional intervention. People coped through informal support networks, through community solidarity, through simply carrying on because alternatives weren't available. The approach worked well enough to prevent social collapse, but it left psychological scars that many carried long after bombing ended. The German miscalculation. The Luftwaffe's strategic bombing campaign failed to achieve its objectives because German planners misunderstood British civilian response to sustained attack. The assumption that bombing would break civilian morale rested on belief that urban populations were psychologically fragile, that sustained casualties and destruction would create panic and demand for peace. This assumption proved incorrect. British civilians responded to bombing with anger and determination rather than fear and submission. The destruction hardened resolve rather than breaking it, creating attitude that endurance was patriotic duty and that giving in to German pressure was unthinkable. The underground shelters contributed to this resilience by providing safety that allowed people to survive bombing physically and psychologically. Knowing that deep shelters existed where bombs couldn't reach provided security that made enduring surface bombing manageable. People could work during day and shelter at night, maintaining economic productivity while surviving German attacks. The arrangement wasn't comfortable, but it was sustainable, allowing London to function, despite sustained bombing that should theoretically have disabled the city. German intelligence recognized that bombing wasn't producing desired effects, but misunderstood why. Reports noted that British civilians weren't panicking, and that economic production continued despite raids. German analysts attributed this to successful British propaganda rather than recognizing genuine popular determination. The misunderstanding led to continuing bombing campaign that consumed German resources without achieving strategic objectives. By spring 1941, the Blitz was effectively ending, not because it had succeeded, but because Germany was redeploying forces for invasion of Soviet Union. The bombing had killed tens of thousands and destroyed substantial property, but had failed to break civilian will or force British government to negotiate. London had endured, and the underground shelters had been essential to that endurance by providing safety that allowed normal life to continue, despite extraordinary circumstances. The statistics of survival. The numbers documented both the scale of sheltering and its success in protecting civilian population during sustained bombing. At peak usage in September-October 1940, approximately 177,000 Londoners sheltered in underground stations nightly. The number varied with bombing intensity. Fewer people sheltered during quiet periods, more during heavy raids. Over the Blitz's duration, perhaps 500,000 Londoners used underground shelters at least occasionally, with perhaps 150,000 regular users who sheltered most nights. The shelters were remarkably safe. Fewer than 70 people were killed in underground stations during entire Blitz, primarily from direct hits on stations at or near surface. The deep-level tunnels proved essentially invulnerable to bombs, providing protection that surface shelters couldn't match. The casualty rate among regular underground shelterers was far lower than among civilians remaining in surface homes or using less effective shelters. The health impacts were mixed. Overcrowding created conditions favorable to disease transmission, and respiratory infections spread readily through sheltering populations. But serious epidemics didn't occur, partly through luck and partly through public health measures that monitored for disease and isolated infected individuals. The conditions were uncomfortable and probably harmful to long-term health, but they weren't catastrophically unhealthy in ways that would have made sheltering untenable. The economic impact was sustainable. People who sheltered overnight generally maintained employment during daytime, allowing war production and essential services to continue. The disruption to sleep and the time spent sheltering reduced productivity somewhat, but not enough to cripple war economy. London functioned throughout the Blitz at capacity that allowed Britain to continue fighting while enduring sustained attack on its capital. The unglamorous truth. The underground shelters weren't triumph of British planning or organization, but emergency response to inadequate official preparation for civilian protection. The government's original prohibition on using stations as shelters reflected genuine concerns about safety and logistics, but it also reflected failure to provide adequate alternatives. If official shelters had been sufficient, civilians wouldn't have forced their way into underground. The fact that civilian initiative overrode official policy demonstrated that authorities had failed to address population's basic need for safety. The conditions underground were never good, crowded, uncomfortable, unhealthy by any reasonable standard. People endured them because alternatives were worse, not because sheltering was pleasant or even particularly safe from health hazards that crowding created. The romanticization of sheltering, as exemplifying British spirit, obscures reality that it was desperate improvisation forced by circumstances rather than planned response to anticipated needs. The resilience Londoners demonstrated was real, but came at cost. The psychological toll of sustained bombing and months of uncomfortable sheltering affected people for years. The health impacts of crowding and disrupted sleep were real. The economic costs of time spent sheltering rather than working or resting properly accumulated across millions of person-hours. The endurance was genuine, but wasn't costless or painless. What the underground shelters demonstrated wasn't that Britain had planned well, or that bombing could be easily endured. They demonstrated that populations facing existential threats will find ways to survive through whatever means available. That civilian determination can overcome inadequate official preparation. That humans will endure extraordinary discomfort to protect themselves and their families when no better alternatives exist. Margaret Collins, emerging each morning to face another day despite exhaustion and fear, represented not triumph of British spirit, but ordinary human stubbornness, refusal to surrender to circumstances, determination to protect her daughter, simple persistence through difficulties that should have been prevented through better planning, but which had to be endured once they occurred. That persistence won no wars by itself, but made winning possible by keeping civilian population alive and functional despite sustained attack intended to break them. The victory was unglamorous, but real. Survival achieved through improvisation and determination when official systems proved inadequate for the challenges they faced.